She did not mean to fall asleep in the Duke of Thornwall's private chamber. She did not mean to be there at all.
Hadrian Casimir Vane, 5th Duke of Thornwall, returned to his private chamber at 12 minutes past midnight. He opened the door. He saw her immediately.
No one will touch you again.
She did not mean to fall asleep in the Duke of Thornwall's private chamber. She did not mean to be there at all. Rosalind Vespera had spent the better part of her 24th year learning to be invisible. It was a skill she had discovered that required daily practice in a palace like this one, a place where every corridor held someone watching. Every dinner table concealed a knife beneath the linen, and every smile from a nobleman meant something entirely different from what it appeared. She had been running, not from a man precisely, from the consequence of overhearing one. It had happened in the East Gallery, 40 minutes before midnight, in the sort of accidental, irrevocable way that only occurred to people who were already having a terrible evening. She had been carrying a lamp and a bundle of correspondence for the Duchess Dowager, her employer, her protector, the only person in Thornwall Palace who had offered her so much as a civil greeting in the 2 weeks since her arrival. She had turned a corner and heard two voices behind a door that stood half an inch ajar. She should have walked faster. She had not walked faster. What she heard in those 90 seconds rewired something in her chest and sent her fleeing down 3 wrong corridors, through a servant's passage she had never used, and into a room she had assumed was vacant. A reading room of some kind, she thought, or perhaps a private study, warm and firelit and mercifully empty. She had pressed her back against the closed door, breathing too hard, her lamp trembling in her grip. She had sat down on the nearest piece of furniture, a chaise of deep charcoal velvet near the hearth, and told herself she would rest for only a moment. Just a moment, until her pulse steadied and her thoughts arranged themselves into something she could act upon. She had been awake for 19 hours. The fire was very warm. She was asleep within minutes. Hadrian Casimir Vane, 5th Duke of Thornwall, returned to his private chamber at 12 minutes past midnight. He was not in a pleasant mood. He had spent the evening navigating a state dinner that had been, in his estimation, a masterfully orchestrated waste of 3 hours, followed by 40 minutes of conversation with the Lord Treasurer that had confirmed several of his worst suspicions and none of his most optimistic theories. He had dismissed his valet in the corridor, wanting quiet, wanting the particular solitude of his own rooms that he had come to regard as the only genuinely honest space left in this palace. He opened the door. He saw her immediately. She was curled on his reading chair with the unconscious elegance of someone who had not chosen the position but had surrendered to it. One hand beneath her cheek, dark hair spilling across the velvet, her lamp set on the floor beside her still casting a small circle of light. She was dressed in the practical gray of a lady's companion, not a courtier's silk, and there was a letter clutched in her right hand even in sleep, fingers tight around it as though she had been running when exhaustion finally claimed her. Hadrian stood in the doorway for a full 10 seconds. His first instinct was the obvious one. Summon the housekeeper, have her removed, close the episode with the efficiency he applied to every other inconvenience that arrived uninvited in his life. His second instinct surprised him. He found he did not move. He studied her instead. The rise and fall of her breathing, the small frown between her brows that suggested even in sleep she was working something out, the letter still gripped in her hand. Something about the grip told him she had not wandered in by accident. Something about the letter told him she had come from somewhere specific. He crossed the room quietly. He did not touch her. He crouched just enough to read the partial address visible on the letter's outer fold, and what he saw there made the evening suddenly, significantly more complicated. He knew that handwriting. He knew that seal. He had been looking for that letter for 3 days. Hadrian straightened slowly. He looked at the sleeping woman on his chaise, this stranger in his private chamber, clutching evidence he needed, unaware of the magnitude of what she had accidentally stumbled into. Then he did something he had not done in longer than he could remember. He sat down across from her in the wing-back chair by the fire, crossed one leg over the other, and waited. Morning arrived gray and certain, the way mornings did in November, light pressing through the heavy curtains like a question no one had answered yet. Rosalind woke all at once, the way she always did when something was wrong. No gradual surfacing, just sudden, complete awareness and the immediate sickening knowledge that she was not in her own room. She sat up. She saw him. The Duke of Thornwall was seated 6 feet away, watching her with an expression she could not read. He was still dressed from the previous evening, not rumpled, not tired, simply present, in the way that powerful men were present, as though the room had rearranged itself around him while she slept. Dark hair, strong jaw, eyes the color of a storm that had already decided where it was going. He was younger than his reputation made him sound. He was also considerably more dangerous in person than any portrait had suggested. He said nothing. She said nothing. For 3 full seconds, they simply looked at each other. Then Rosalind did the only thing that felt honest. She sat up straight, smoothed the front of her ruined gown with one hand, kept the letter pressed against her side with the other, and said, "I suppose you require an explanation." Something shifted in the Duke's face. It was not a smile. It was the ghost of a reaction, there and gone before it could be classified. "I require several things," he said. His voice was exactly what she had expected. Low, controlled, the kind of voice that had learned long ago that it did not need to raise itself. "But let us begin with your name, Rosalind Vespera." She held his gaze. "I am a companion to the Duchess Dowager. I arrived at Thornwall Palace a fortnight ago. I know who you are." The words were not unkind. They were simply precise. "I meant your name as a beginning, not as a request for credentials." He tilted his head slightly, just a fraction. "What are you doing in my private chamber, Miss Vespera?" "I was lost," she said. "And then I was exhausted, and then I was unconscious." A pause. "In that order. And the letter?" Her grip on it tightened involuntarily. She watched his eyes track the movement and hated herself for giving away so much with a single reflex. "I found it," she said. "Slipped under the wrong door, mine specifically. Addressed to whom?" "Not to me." She met his gaze. "And not to you either, which makes its contents rather interesting to both of us." A silence settled between them. The fire had burned low overnight, but still held enough warmth to make the room feel private in a way that morning rooms rarely did. Outside, Rosalind could hear the distant sound of the palace beginning to wake. Footsteps in corridors, the clatter of kitchens, the first muffled voices of a household that did not yet know its master had spent the night watching a stranger sleep. Hadrian rose from the chair. He was tall. She had not fully appreciated that from across a dining room. And he moved with the unhurried certainty of someone who had never once needed to rush toward anything because everything he needed eventually came to him. He crossed to the window and stood with his back half turned, looking out at the gray November gardens. "You heard something," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, in the East Gallery," she stilled. "How did you—" "Because I know which door that letter was meant to reach." He turned then, looking at her over his shoulder. "And I know which corridor leads from that door to this wing." Something moved behind his eyes, calculation, and underneath it, something quieter. "You were frightened." "I was careful," she corrected. "There is a difference." He turned fully. He studied her for a moment, the set of her jaw, the steadiness of her hands despite the fact that she was alone in a room with one of the most powerful men in England. "Yes," he said quietly, "there is." He crossed back toward the desk and picked up a small silver letter opener, which he turned once in his fingers and set down. A thinking gesture, she realized. A man accustomed to working through problems methodically while the rest of the world waited. "You have 2 choices," he said. "I summon the housekeeper and you are escorted from this wing with a reasonable story about a sleepwalking incident. You return to your duties. You give me the letter. We will never speak of this again." She waited. "Or," she said. He looked at her directly. "Or you tell me exactly what you heard in that gallery, word for word, and I decide whether you are useful or dangerous." "Those are not particularly attractive options," she said. "No," he agreed. "They are not." A pause. "But they are the ones available to you at present." Rosalind looked at the letter in her hand. Then she looked at the Duke of Thornwall, standing in the gray morning light of his private chamber, waiting with the patience of a man who had learned that patience was simply another form of power. She made her decision. "There is a third option," she said. "You tell me what is actually in this letter, and then we decide together what to do about it." The silence that followed lasted long enough that she thought she had miscalculated, that she had pushed too far, too fast, in the wrong direction entirely. Then the Duke of Thornwall said her name. Not Miss Vespera. Not you. Her name, Rosalind, spoke quietly, testing the weight of it, the way a man said a word he was deciding whether to keep. "Sit down," he said, "and do not give me the letter yet." He moved toward the small table near the window where a breakfast tray had been silently deposited by some invisible servant. "You look as though you have not eaten since yesterday afternoon." She had not, as it happened. She sat down. The arrangement was explained to her over strong coffee and cold bread, delivered in the Duke's precise, unhurried manner, as though he were discussing estate management and not a proposition that would change the entire trajectory of her time at Thornwall Palace. She would remain in the household. Her position as the Duchess Dowager's companion would continue without interruption. She would tell no one what she had overheard in the East Gallery the previous evening. She would not discuss the letter, its contents, or the name on its seal with any living person. In exchange, he would ensure her position was secure. Her small salary would continue uninterrupted. Any social difficulties she encountered, the subtle cruelties of court hierarchy that she had already begun to experience, would quietly resolve themselves, and her family's debts, which she had not mentioned, which she had told no one about, which she had assumed were her private burden to carry in silence, would be addressed. She set down her coffee cup very carefully. "You have investigated me," she said. "I investigate everyone who enters this palace." He said it without apology. "You arrived with excellent references, modest circumstances, and a father whose creditors have been accumulating interest for 3 years. He met her gaze. "None of that changes what you heard or what you are holding, but it clarifies the situation." She wanted to be angry. She was angry. A small, clean anger at being so thoroughly known by a man she had spoken to for less than 20 minutes. But underneath the anger was something she recognized as respect, and she had spent too many years valuing honesty over comfort to pretend otherwise. "You are telling me," she said slowly, "that refusing is not actually a viable option." "I am telling you," he replied, "that accepting makes you safe, and that refusing leaves you navigating whatever you overheard last night without any of the resources required to survive it." She looked at him for a long moment. "You watched me sleep," she said, "for hours, and your first instinct was to investigate my finances." Something crossed his face, not quite embarrassment, but close to it. "My first instinct was to wake you," he said. "My second instinct was to ensure I understood what I was dealing with." "And what are you dealing with?" The answer came after a pause that felt deliberate. "Someone unexpected," he said. And then he poured her more coffee, and the conversation moved on, and Rosalind filed those 2 words away in the same place she kept things she was not yet ready to examine too closely. She accepted. The days that followed established their own quiet rhythm. Rosalind resumed her duties with the Duchess Dowager, a woman named Elspeth Vane, Hadrian's grandmother by blood and the undisputed sovereign of Thornwall Palace's social architecture. Elspeth was 81 years old, sharp as a blade that had never once been dulled by sentiment, and in possession of a dry, withering humor that Rosalind had come, in 2 weeks, to genuinely love. "You slept in his chamber," Elspeth said on the 3rd morning, without looking up from her correspondence. Rosalind went very still. "Your Grace, I am not accusing you of anything interesting." Elspeth turned a page. "Hadrian told me himself, quite matter-of-factly, which means he has already decided something and wishes me to understand the situation before I hear it second-hand." She looked up then, eyes bright and ancient and missing nothing. "He also told me you argued with him over breakfast. I expressed a difference of opinion. He said you called his 3rd option inadequate and proposed a 4th. He agreed with it." Elspeth made a small sound that might, in another woman, have been a laugh. "He did not agree with it. He was startled by it. Those are not the same thing. she returned to her correspondence. He has not been startled by a single thing in approximately 6 years. I find it encouraging. Rosalind decided not to ask what Elspeth found it encouraging for. She had enough to think about. She had begun to notice Hadrian the way one noticed a change in weather, not because it announced itself, but because the atmosphere shifted when it arrived. She learned the sound of his footsteps in the corridor outside the Duchess Dowager's sitting room. She learned that he took his morning review of estate documents standing at the window of his study because he thought better upright. She learned that he had a habit of pinching the bridge of his nose when he was being asked to explain something he found obvious, and that he never did so with cruelty, only with the faintest, almost imperceptible impatience of a man whose mind moved faster than most conversations. She learned, on a Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd week of November, that he laughed. It happened in the East Garden, where Elspeth had dispatched her to collect a specific variety of late-blooming rosemary that the old woman insisted the kitchen could not substitute. Rosalind had been crouched near the garden wall, attempting to communicate with a groundskeeper's small son who had decided to help by offering her a single pebble with great ceremony, when she heard it. Low, genuine, unguarded, over in a second. She looked up. Hadrian was standing at the edge of the garden path, and he had clearly witnessed the pebble ceremony. The laugh was already gone, tucked back behind the composed exterior that he wore the way other men wore coats. But it had been there. She had seen it. He saw her see it. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the small boy offered him a pebble too, and Hadrian, without breaking eye contact with Rosalind, accepted it with the gravity of a man receiving a state document. She smiled before she could stop herself. She looked away first. She thought about that exchange for the rest of the afternoon, and told herself firmly that it meant nothing at all. His name was Lord Phineas Ashcroft, and he arrived at Thornwall Palace on a Friday morning like sunlight through a window. Warm, welcome, impossible to look directly at for too long. He was everything Hadrian Vane was not in a drawing room. Bright, easy, the kind of handsome that invited rather than intimidated. He laughed often and genuinely, remembered every name he had ever heard, and had the particular gift of making whoever he was speaking with feel like the most interesting person he had encountered all year. He found Rosalind in the library on his second afternoon. She had been reaching for a volume on the upper shelf, a history of the Thornwall estate that Elspeth had requested, when she became aware of someone behind her. "Allow me," said a voice, and a hand appeared above her own, retrieving the book with effortless ease. She turned. He was smiling, open, uncalculating, a smile that had nothing hidden in it. "Lord Ashcroft," she said. She had been introduced briefly at dinner. "Thank you, Miss Vespera." He offered the book with a small bow. "I understand you've been at Thornwall nearly a month now. I hope the palace hasn't entirely swallowed you." "I've managed to maintain most of my dimensions," she said. He laughed, delighted, surprised. Most women would have said something polite. Most women haven't met the Duchess Dowager yet. He laughed again, and this time Rosalind laughed too, just briefly, just the ghost of it, and she felt the genuine pleasure of a simple, uncomplicated moment in a place where every previous moment had carried weight. They talked for 20 minutes about books, about the history of the estate, about Elspeth's infamous habit of annotating borrowed volumes in ink and never apologizing for it. Phineas was charming and funny, and seemed to have no agenda whatsoever beyond the pleasant occupation of the afternoon. She did not notice Hadrian until she was already laughing at something Phineas had said. He was passing the library doorway, not pausing, not entering, simply moving through the corridor in the direction of his study with his usual purposeful stride. But he slowed, just fractionally, as he passed the open door. His gaze moved from Phineas to Rosalind. It stayed on Rosalind for 1 second, too. And then he continued walking without breaking stride, his expression giving nothing away. Nothing at all. Rosalind looked back at Phineas. He was saying something about the estate's history that she had stopped hearing entirely. She was thinking about that look instead. That evening at dinner, Hadrian was impeccably courteous to every person at the table. He did not speak to her once, she noticed. She could not decide whether noticing was a problem. The court announcement came 3 days later. delivered with the practiced brightness of a social coordinator who had been building toward it for weeks. The king, who was visiting Thornwall Palace as part of his autumn progress, wished to host a formal presentation, a dinner and dancing, the kind of structured social display that palace life built entire seasons around. Lord Phineas had specifically requested, in writing, that Miss Rosalind Vespera be included in the evening's proceedings. The announcement was made at dinner. Rosalind was seated 6 places from the king and 4 from Hadrian, and she watched the Duke receive the news from across the white linen expanse of the formal table with the small, careful attention she had been developing over the past weeks. His hand, resting beside his wineglass, curled slowly into a fist. She watched the knuckles go white. She watched them release. He raised his glass and drank, and his face was perfectly composed, and no one at the table noticed anything at all. No one except Elspeth, who caught Rosalind's eye across the table with the expression of a woman watching a play she had seen before and was enjoying for the second time. Rosalind looked away. She thought, "This is not my concern." She thought, "He has made it very clear that I am a convenient arrangement and nothing more." She thought, against her better judgment and every piece of sensible advice she had ever given herself. He curled his hand into a fist. The presentation night arrived like a verdict. Rosalind dressed in borrowed finery. Elspeth, predictably, had arranged everything without being asked, producing a gown of deep midnight blue that fit as though it had been made for her specifically, and probably, knowing Elspeth, had been. Her hair had been attended to by the Duchess Dowager's own lady's maid, and the effect was something she barely recognized in the mirror. Not a lady's companion, not a girl from a financially diminished household, not someone's convenient arrangement. Just herself, fully visible, perhaps for the first time in years. She walked into the grand hall on Lord Phineas's arm, and she felt the shift in the room before she had fully crossed the threshold. Heads turned. She was accustomed to being overlooked. The opposite was disorienting in a way she had not anticipated. Hadrian was already present. Of course he was. He was always already present, arriving to rooms before anyone else, as though he needed to assess them first. He was standing with a cluster of senior court figures near the far wall, and he was not looking at the door. Until he was. She felt it rather than saw it the moment his attention shifted, the way the air between them changed even across 30 feet of candlelit hall. She did not look at him directly. She was learning not to. But she was aware of him the entire evening with an accuracy that was starting to feel like a problem. The first dance was Phineas's, and he was a good dancer, easy and attentive, making her feel comfortable rather than performed at. She relaxed into it. She let herself enjoy the music, the warmth of the hall, the simple pleasure of an evening that did not require her to be vigilant. She was halfway through the second dance with Phineas when she felt the shift. Not a sound, not a word. Simply a presence, close, certain, already decided, and then Phineas had stopped moving, and Hadrian Vane was standing at her left, hand extended with the quiet finality of a man who had never once in his life been refused, and was not expecting to start now. Phineas looked at the Duke for a moment. Then he stepped back with a practiced social smile that did not reach his eyes and released her hand. Rosalind looked up at Hadrian. "That was rude," she said, keeping her voice low, because they were in the middle of a crowded hall, and she had some surviving instincts. "Yes," he agreed. "You owe Lord Ashcroft an apology. I owe Lord Ashcroft a great number of things." His hand settled at her waist, firm, deliberate, and they began to move. He danced the way he did everything, with complete, unhurried competence. None of them are apologies. You cannot simply appropriate other people's dance partners because you... She stopped herself. "Because I what?" His voice was precisely neutral. She pressed her lips together. "Because you decide you would prefer it, and yet here you are. You didn't give me a choice. You always have a choice." He turned her through the music, and she was acutely, unhelpfully aware of how close they were. Close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through the thin blue silk of her gown. Close enough that when he spoke again, she felt it as much as heard it. "I simply made mine visible." She looked up at him. A mistake, she realized immediately, because he was already looking down at her with that expression she had never managed to fully translate, the one that lives somewhere between calculation and something raw and less controlled. "Why?" she asked. "Ashcroft is not what he appears. You said that before, and I will keep saying it until you believe me." A pause, and then something shifted in his voice, just slightly, just enough. "He was watching you before you entered the room, Rosalind. The way a man watches something he has already decided belongs to him. The use of her name, Rosalind, not Miss Vespera, moved through her like warm water." She kept her voice steady. "Perhaps he simply finds me interesting. Perhaps." Hadrian's hand at her waist pressed fractionally closer, a movement so subtle it was nearly undeniable. "So do I. The difference is that I will not pretend otherwise when it is inconvenient." The music ended. He stepped back. The distance between them returned to something socially appropriate, and the moment collapsed back into the ordinary architecture of a court evening as though it had never occurred. Except that it had, and they both knew it. She watched him walk away and made herself breathe normally. She was in serious trouble. She found the truth about the letter that same night. It was late. The formal presentation had wound down to the quieter social hours, and Rosalind had retreated to the corridor outside the hall to collect herself, leaning against the cool stone wall with her eyes closed, and her heart conducting itself in a manner she did not entirely approve of. She had intended to return to the hall within minutes. Instead, she heard voices from the small antechamber 20 feet to her right. She heard Phineas, and she heard him say, clearly, in a tone stripped entirely of its public warmth, "The girl has read too much. She needs to disappear quietly before the Duke decides she matters." Rosalind did not breathe. A second voice, lower, unfamiliar, responded, "And if she already matters?" "Phineas, then we accelerate the timeline. Thornwall has been a problem for a long time. We resolve two problems at once." She was already moving before the sentence finished, not running, walking fast, through the side corridor, processing what she had just heard and stacking it against everything else she had already known. The letter, the name on the seal, the contents she had read in those terrible 90 seconds in the East Gallery 3 weeks ago. It is not about reputation, she had told herself then, trying to find a simpler explanation. It is something worse, an assassination. The word had circled her mind for 3 weeks like smoke she could not clear. She had told herself she was misreading. She had told herself she was a lady's companion from modest circumstances who had no business drawing such conclusions. But she had not misread, and Phineas Ashcroft was not a charming, uncomplicated man who had wandered into her orbit by accident. She turned the corner. A hand closed around her wrist. Not Phineas. One of his men. She had seen this man in the corridor outside the antechamber twice in the past week and filed him away as staff without examining the filing more carefully. He was larger than her, and his grip was certain, and for one lurching second she felt genuine fear move through her like cold water. Then she drove her heel into the instep of his right foot with everything she had. His grip loosened. She twisted free, the way her old governess had taught her when she was 12, a woman who had believed firmly that a young lady should be able to extract herself from any grip a man might place on her, and she ran, not toward the hall, not toward the servants' quarters, toward the one place in the palace she knew was safe. She pounded on his door with the side of her fist, harder than she intended, and it opened almost immediately, as though he had not been deeply asleep, as though he had been awake and waiting for something, which she would think about later when she had the capacity for it. He took one look at her, one look, at the red mark forming on her wrist, at her breathing, at her eyes, which were holding steady, but only because she was applying a significant amount of internal force to keep them that way. Something happened to his face. It was not anger, precisely. It was quieter than anger. It was the expression of a man in whom something very controlled had just been decided irrevocably. "Tell me everything," he said. Now. She did. She stood in the middle of his study and told him everything from the beginning. The East Gallery, the voices, the letter, what she had read, what she had heard tonight, the man in the corridor, all of it. She kept her voice level. She watched his face while she spoke, because she had learned to read him in pieces over the past weeks, and she needed to know his reaction in real time. He listened without interrupting. He stood very still. The only movement was the slight tightening around his eyes as she reached the part about the antechamber, and then the absolute perfect stillness that followed the words accelerated the timeline. When she finished, the silence lasted long enough to become something she could feel. "You came to warn me," he said finally. His voice was very quiet. "Not to the palace guard, not to my grandmother, to me." She said nothing. What was there to say? Why? The word was careful. Deliberate. She met his gaze. "Because whatever is in that letter is aimed at you specifically, and because She stopped. He waited. She could not finish the sentence aloud. Not yet. Not standing in his study at midnight with adrenaline still moving through her system and the red mark on her wrist announcing exactly how much danger she had narrowly escaped. Hadrian crossed the room toward her. Slowly, with that same unhurried certainty she had been watching for weeks. He stopped close. Closer than was required for conversation, close enough that she had to tilt her chin up to hold his gaze. He reached out and touched the mark on her wrist. Just his fingertips, impossibly gentle, tracing the edge of it with the care of a man who understood that tenderness, applied carefully, was a more powerful thing than any other force available to him. "No one will touch you again," he said. 3 words, 7 syllables. She felt each one land somewhere beneath her ribs and remain there. "You don't know that," she said. "I know it," he said simply. She looked at his face, at the absolute certainty there, at the quiet, contained fury underneath it, at the thing she had been refusing to name for 3 weeks that was sitting very close to the surface now, watching her with gray eyes in the firelight. "Hadrian," she said. "There are rooms adjacent to my chamber," he said. "You will sleep there tonight. The door will be guarded." He released her wrist, gently, carefully. "Tomorrow this will be finished." She should have argued. She should have cited propriety, independence, the complicated optics of a lady's companion occupying the rooms beside the Duke's private apartments. She had 17 arguments ready, well-reasoned, and sensible. She said, "All right." He stepped back. The fire crackled. Outside, the palace continued its midnight quiet, unaware that anything had changed. Rosalind. He said her name the way he had begun to say it, not as a title, not as a form of address, but as something that belonged to him specifically. She looked up. "I am glad you came to me." She held his gaze for 1 moment longer than she should have. Then she went to the adjacent room, lay down in the dark, and stared at the ceiling, and thought about the warmth of his fingertips against her wrist, and the 3 words that were still reverberating through her like bells. In the morning, she found the note. "Stay inside until I return. This'll be finished today." Hadrian Vane's handwriting was exactly what she would have expected. Clean, precise, the letters of a man who had been educated to write beautifully and had kept the discipline long after it stopped being required. She stayed inside for 45 minutes. Then she put on her coat and went to find a window with a view of the great hall. He had assembled everything. She did not know when he had slept. Perhaps he had not. Perhaps the Duke of Thornwall simply did not require sleep when there was a problem to dismantle. She would not have been surprised to learn it. Hadrian stood before the court in the great hall's anteroom, where the king's senior advisor had convened an emergency session at the Duke's specific request. He was dressed impeccably, not in court finery, but in the kind of clean, severe dark clothing that announced a man who had not come to impress anyone and had no need to try. Phineas Ashcroft stood opposite him. Rosalind, watching from the upper corridor through the narrow gallery window, could see Phineas's charm in operation. The easy posture, the practiced openness, the smile that made everyone want to believe him. She had believed it herself, briefly, and the memory made her feel something cold and precise. Hadrian placed the first document on the table, then the second, then the third. Each one landed with the quiet finality of a door closing. The letter, its seal, its contents, the handwriting that belonged to a man connected to Phineas by 3 documented transactions she could see referenced in the second document, the palace guard testimony. 3 separate guards who had noted Phineas's man in corridors adjacent to both the East Gallery and Rosalind's quarters over a period of 12 days. The correspondence trail. Hadrian had apparently spent the previous night compiling from sources she could not imagine, because he was a man who had spent 15 years ensuring he had access to information before anyone thought to make it relevant. Phineas's charm held for 7 minutes. Then the mask began to show its seams. "This is circumstantial," he said. His voice had lost its warmth. What remained was something thinner, something that sounded like a man recalculating his options in real time. "The Duke has a personal interest in discrediting me. He's been threatened by my family's standing, your family's standing," Hadrian said, without inflection, "is not something I have ever found threatening. He has fabricated, I have documented." Hadrian's voice remained precisely level. He placed a final document on the table. "This is a statement from Mary Dawkins, daughter of a palace servant who was approached 3 months ago by a man fitting your personal secretary's description and offered compensation to report on my private correspondence." He looked at Phineas with the gray, unhurried gaze of a man who had already won and was simply completing the formality. "I have also been made aware that you personally supervised the placement of a letter, the one currently in evidence, in a corridor you believed led to my private communication channels. You were incorrect about which door. The letter was received instead by Miss Vespera." A pause. "You have spent the past 3 weeks attempting to remedy that error. You will not be given a 4th opportunity to do so." The room was very quiet. Phineas's smile had disappeared entirely. What remained was something smaller, younger, and frightened. The face beneath the performance, stripped of every layer of practiced charm. He attempted a final gambit. He turned his attention to the king's advisor. Elegant, calculated. The kind of argument designed to create just enough doubt. The woman herself may be a party to this. The Duke's interest in her is well known. He may be using her to— "She is the reason you are standing here," Hadrian said, instead of having left the country already. His voice had not changed. It was still precise, still controlled, still the voice of a man who did not need to raise it. But Rosalind, watching from above, could hear something beneath it, something that was not for the room, that was not part of the official proceedings. "Consider that before you speak her name again." Phineas said nothing else. He was escorted from the hall by the palace guard within the hour. Rosalind was in the garden when Hadrian found her. She had not precisely disobeyed the note. She had finished her breakfast, waited for the sounds of the formal session to conclude, and then walked outside because the alternative was staying in the adjacent room, thinking too many thoughts in a confined space, and she had always been better at thinking outdoors. She was standing near the winter roses, her arms crossed, watching the palace doors, when she heard his footsteps on the gravel path behind her. She turned. He looked tired. Not dramatically, not the theatrical exhaustion of men who wish to be pitied, just the clean, honest weariness of someone who had not slept and had spent the morning doing something difficult and had now completed it and was letting the armor down, just slightly, just enough. "It's done," he said. "I know," she said. "I watched from the gallery." A beat. "I told you to stay inside." "You did." She held his gaze. "I don't follow instructions particularly well." He looked at her for a moment. "I know," he said. Something moved in his voice. The same something she had heard the previous night, sitting just below the surface of everything, refusing to be fully controlled. "I find I don't mind it." She looked at him, at the exhaustion and the relief and the carefully maintained composure and the thing underneath all of it that she had been refusing to name for weeks now, and felt her own composure do something complicated. "He threatened me," she said. She had not planned to say it. It came out plainly, without drama, simply because it was true, and she was too tired to arrange it into something more manageable. "In the corridor last night, I was frightened. I know." He closed the distance between them. Not all of it, but enough, standing near enough that she could see the lines of tension still present around his eyes. "I know you were, and he stopped. He pressed his lips together briefly, the gesture of a man choosing words with unusual care. "I am not accustomed to fear," he said. "I have managed it generally by ensuring the things I value are not vulnerably positioned. She understood what that meant. She understood what he was not quite saying. And yet, she said quietly, and yet. He looked at her directly, and for once there was nothing in his face that was being managed or maintained or positioned for any audience whatsoever. You are here, and I find that I have been considerably less composed about that fact than I would prefer. Rosalind looked at him for a long, careful moment. Then she said, very gently, you watched me sleep, for hours, in your private chair, and your immediate instinct was to wait for me to wake up, rather than send me away. Yes. That is objectively unusual behavior for a man who claims indifference. I have never claimed indifference. His voice was quiet. I have claimed distance. They are not the same thing. She looked away toward the winter roses, stripped of their blooms but still present, still structured, still holding their form against the gray November air. What are you saying, Hadrian? He was quiet for long enough that she looked back at him. I am saying, he said, that you walked into my chamber by accident and made it impossible for me to be in it alone anymore. A pause. I am saying that I have spent considerable effort over the past weeks telling myself this was manageable. I am saying that last night, when I saw the mark on your wrist, I understood the effort had been unsuccessful. He took a breath. I am saying that I would like to stop pretending otherwise, if you are willing. Rosalind looked at him. She thought about the pebble in the garden, and the cut-in during the dance, and the note on the table, and his voice saying, "No one will touch you again," with the certainty of a man who never made promises he did not keep. She thought about how long she had been invisible, and how different it felt to be seen. I am not easy, she said. I have opinions and I express them. I argue. I walk outside when I've been told to stay in. I will never simply defer to you because you are a duke, and I am. You are remarkable, he said. The words came quietly, without ceremony, without the performance of romance. Just a fact, delivered with the same precision he brought to everything. And I have not the smallest interest in a woman who defers to me. The ones who defer to me are tedious. Something that was almost, a smile. I have extensive experience of tedium. This is not that. She looked at him. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, all right. It was not a dramatic declaration. It was not a surrender or a capitulation, or the kind of thing that would have made sense in the context of a formal court arrangement. It was simply the truth, said plainly, in a winter garden, between two people who had been circling the honest version of things for long enough. He reached out and took her hand. Not the way he had touched her wrist the previous night, not with the careful, deliberate tenderness of a man managing his own restraint, but simply, naturally, his fingers closing around hers with the ease of something that had always been intended. She let him. The royal summons arrived 3 days later. A gilt-edged card on a silver tray, delivered by a footman who could not quite manage his own expression of controlled surprise. Hadrian read it, set it down, and told Rosalind about it over breakfast in the morning room with the same directness he brought to everything. The king wishes to see me, he said, this afternoon. She looked at him over her coffee. About his observations regarding my relationship with his palace's most recently appointed lady's companion. A pause. The court has noticed, the king has noticed. Something that was almost wry moved through his expression. My grandmother has almost certainly been helpful. Should I be alarmed? No. He said it simply. The king is a reasonable man, and I have no intention of asking permission. He met her gaze. I intend to inform him of my intentions and extend a courtesy, not request approval. She set down her coffee. And what are your intentions? He looked at her steadily. To marry you, he said, if you will have me. The morning room was very quiet. Outside, the November light was thin and gray and entirely beautiful. You are proposing to me over breakfast coffee, she said. I am informing you of my intentions before I inform the king. He paused. Technically, I am asking. Technically, she agreed. He waited. I will require an actual proposal, she said. Not an announcement. Not an information transfer. A proper question. Something genuine moved across his face. Tonight, he said. In the library. The king received him that afternoon. Hadrian stood in the royal study without fidgeting, without performing, and said what he had come to say in less than 3 minutes. He intended to marry Rosalind Vespera. She was of good family, excellent character, and had, over the preceding weeks, demonstrated more genuine integrity than the majority of the court combined. He was not seeking permission. He was offering the king the courtesy of being informed before the announcement was made. The king studied him for a moment. "I have watched you carry Thornwall for 15 years, the king said finally. Alone, without complaint, without asking anything of anyone. A pause. "She must be extraordinary." "She is," Hadrian said, without hesitation, without qualification. The way a man said something that had passed beyond opinion into fact. The king nodded once. "Then do not waste more time," he said. The library was where it happened. Rosalind was reading, or pretending to read, because she had been reading the same paragraph for 20 minutes and retaining approximately none of it, when she heard his footsteps. She knew them now, with the precision of a woman who had been paying attention for longer than she had admitted to herself. She kept her eyes on the page. The footsteps stopped. She heard him settle into the chair across from her. The reading chair, the one that had become his chair by simple repetition over the past weeks. The way things became certain through enough repetition. She lowered the book. He was watching her. Of course he was. "Well," she said. He reached into his coat. He placed something on the table between them. A ring. Old, heavy, deeply beautiful, a sapphire of extraordinary depth set in silver, the Thornwall crest engraved along the band with the fine certain lines of a craftsman who had understood permanence. It was not a showy thing. It was the ring of a house that had existed for 5 centuries and intended to exist for 5 more. "To stop being a fool," Hadrian said quietly, "and to ask you to stay. Not in borrowed rooms, not under the terms of an arrangement that served neither of us as well as we pretended." He held her gaze, and there was nothing in his face that was being managed. No distance, no composure maintained for appearances, just the man, stripped of everything except the truth of what he wanted. "As my wife, as the Duchess of Thornwall, as the woman who fell asleep in my private chamber and made it impossible for me to pretend I was content with emptiness." Rosalind looked at the ring. She thought about the night she had run down 3 wrong corridors and collapsed onto a velvet chaise in exhaustion. She thought about waking to find gray eyes watching her across a firelit room with an expression she had not understood at the time and had spent 3 weeks slowly translating. She thought about pebbles and dances and notes on tables and the warmth of his hand closing around hers in a winter garden. She looked at him. "You watched me sleep," she said. "Yes." "For hours." "Yes." "In your private chair, in your private chamber, without waking me or summoning anyone, simply because you—" She stopped. She made herself finish it. "Simply because you didn't want to." "Yes." His voice was quiet and entirely certain. "That is deeply strange behavior, Hadrian." "Yes." The ghost of that rare smile, the one she had seen in the garden with the pebble, the one she had been filing away like contraband. "Will you marry me anyway?" She picked up the ring. She held it for a moment, feeling its weight, feeling the cold solidity of it, the centuries of it, the unmistakable reality of what it meant. Then she slid it onto her own finger, looked at him, and said, "Don't make me regret this." He stood. He crossed to her with that deliberate, unhurried certainty. No rush, because he had learned patience was its own form of power, and because he had waited long enough for this specific moment and intended to arrive at it properly. He cupped her face in both hands, gently, with the same impossible care he had shown touching the mark on her wrist. She tilted her chin up. He kissed her. Not the breathless urgency of people who had been waiting too long and could no longer be careful. Something better than that. Something deliberate and warm and entirely honest, the kiss of 2 people who had navigated their way to each other through difficulty and stubbornness and weeks of careful, pointed not quite saying things, and had arrived here with full understanding of what they were choosing. She kissed him back. The announcement was made at court that evening. The Duke of Thornwall was to be married, his intended, Miss Rosalind Vespera, companion to the Duchess Dowager. Every fan in the room fluttered at once. Every ambitious mother set down her glass. The murmur that moved through the assembled court was audible even from the doorway, where Rosalind stood beside Hadrian and heard it all with the calm of a woman who had survived worse things than gossip. Hadrian's hand was at the small of her back, warm, steady, unmistakable. Not possessive in the way that diminished. Possessive in the way that is announced. She is beside me, and I am where I choose to be, and both of these facts are permanent. Across the room, the Duchess Dowager Elspeth raised her glass. Her ancient eyes found Rosalind's, and she nodded once, the acknowledgement of a woman who had watched this palace eat people alive for 80 years, and had been waiting a very long time to watch someone not be eaten. Rosalind held her gaze. She nodded back. Hadrian bent slightly, his lips near her ear, and said very quietly, "Second thoughts?" She thought about a letter under the wrong door. She thought about a cold chaise and a warm fire and gray eyes that had watched her sleep and decided to wait for morning. She thought about 3 words spoken in a midnight study that had never quite left her. "No one will touch you again." "None," she said. She felt him exhale. Just barely. Just the small, honest release of a man who had been more uncertain than he had allowed anyone to see. Then the music started. He offered his arm. She took it. And they walked together into the warm light of the great hall, leaving behind the borrowed rooms and the temporary arrangements, and the careful, practiced invisibility she had worn for too long. She was not invisible anymore. She had fallen asleep in the wrong room, in the wrong wing, in the wrong man's private chamber, and by morning, nothing had been the same. It turned out to be the best accident of her life. There is a quiet truth buried in Rosalind and Hadrian's story that is worth carrying with you. She did not become visible by demanding to be seen. She became visible by refusing to disappear. There is a difference, and it matters. In the moments when the world tells us to make ourselves smaller, to be grateful for the borrowed rooms, to accept that arrangements and duties are the ceiling of what we can expect, it is an act of genuine courage to remain fully, stubbornly, honestly ourselves. Not loudly, not dramatically, simply present, clear-eyed, unwilling to be erased. Hadrian did not fall in love with the performance. He fell in love with a woman who, even asleep, even running, even frightened, refused to stop being exactly who she was. And she did not love him because he was powerful or because he offered safety. She loved him because he noticed her, not her credentials, not her circumstances, but her, and chose to wait for morning instead of sending her away. That is the love worth waiting for. That is the love worth being exactly yourself to find. If this story found you at the right moment, if it gave you warmth, or hope, or simply a few hours of beautiful escape, then consider leaving a comment below. Tell us which moment stayed with you. Tell us what you felt when Hadrian waited through the night without waking her, or when Rosalind said, "Don't make me regret this," and slid the ring onto her own finger. Your words matter here. They help us know that this community is real, and that the stories we tell are landing somewhere that needs them. If you loved this story, please like this video. It takes 1 second, and it helps more people find their way to stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't yet. There are more stories coming. More dukes, more impossible love, more women who refuse to be invisible, more men learning, too late and then just in time, what they cannot live without. And share this with someone who needs to be reminded today. You are not invisible. You are never invisible. Sometimes you simply have not yet fallen asleep in the right room. We will see you in the next story.